From disturbing man-made horrors to mythological entities. In this Halloween special, I'm gonna cover one analog horror for each state. And in order for this video to be possible, I had to make some rules that will appear on the screen. Thanks to our Patreon support Pawn, and I'm Sir Chris. I explore the internet and I make videos about it. Let's go. Alabama. A classic. Marble Hornets was one of the first analog horror series to appear here on YouTube, so much so that it has over 90 episodes in total. Marble Hornets tells the story from the perspective of Jay, a friend of Alex, in which Alex, during the recording of his film, mysteriously ends up becoming emotionally altered, to the point that it affects his personality and makes him want to destroy the progress of the film, in which Jay, after convincing him, ends up getting Alex's tapes, and from here, the investigation begins. As Jay explores the tapes, he begins to notice Alex's paranoid behavior, since he was constantly looking for something, or rather, looking for somebody, the operator, in which he ends up driving Alex insane, and he completely loses it and tries to kill everyone who has a connection to the operator, including himself, since he thinks that this was the only way to get rid of him. Alaska. This name is huge, so let's call it NAD. The Great North Alaskan Disaster is part of the second season of Arcadia's series, created by Chilling Abyss. The story tells us about an incident that happened and affected North Alaska. The explosion of one of the largest laboratories on December 23rd of 1983, which made the north of Alaska uninhabitable due to what I presume to be chemical waste. In the first 72 hours, they managed to evacuate a large part of the region, but not everyone was so lucky. The impact was so catastrophic that 5 years later, the explosion affected the wildlife of the region and caused the animals to migrate to the south, and also led to the construction of the wall to contain the horrors that the north now held. Arizona. Marocta is an analog horror and an EAS scenario created by FT. It tells us about several mysterious cases of deaths in Arizona caused by a mythological entity. According to records, this entity had been defeated around the 16th century, but ended up returning back in 2026. Who knows, maybe this will happen in 2 years. Due to several incidents and sightings, his appearance was described as a mixture of a beast, a fox, and a wolf at the same time. The entity was intelligent, to the point of waiting for the best moments to attack, as seen in the first mystery of this tape, the death of 7 campers, where the entity waited for them to go to the tent to attack them. The terror lasted only for 4 days, with a total of 2,000 casualties, where the creature was considered unstoppable, to the point that the army and the police departments started to give up on fighting against it, since bullets were doing nothing, until they discovered the demon's only weakness, xenon gas. And with it, Arizona contains the beast once more, for now. California. This entry is well known. The Smile tapes tells us about a drug that was circulating in the United States called Smile, that in a short time, it was already responsible for 500 deaths, since when ingested, it made the victim infected, and weeks later, the infected would attack and pass the virus to healthy people, as we can see in the attack of Shedinilu in California. The disease also made the victim laugh constantly and slowly caused the muscles in the jaw to fuse with other muscles in the face, thus forming a smile. The disease was quote-unquote unstoppable because within 30 minutes of the infected's death, the body would release spores through the mouth, infecting anyone nearby. With the escalation of the virus in 2 cities, the government is forced to close and bomb the infected cities, thus putting an end to the disease and many innocent lives. Colorado. Imagine a machine that can read, record, and take photos of your dreams while you're sleeping. Somnium Dream Viewer is exactly that. An analog horror where a company called Somnium Microtechnologies creates and sells the machine Somnium Dream Viewer, which promises to capture images of the user's dreams and nightmares. As much as it had good intentions, it actually caused the user to have bizarre nightmares, as we can see in Charles' story, where in his empty dream, he ends up finding his house and a man made of static, in which when he tries to touch him, he wakes up. But this is only the beginning, because it is also discovered that the machine caused these nightmarish entities to affect users while they were awake, in which these events are considered as a disease called waking dream hallucinations. Now, you will never escape the monsters from your nightmares. Florida. Honestly, the name says it all already. The Blood Swamp is a short analog horror created by Anomaly Archive. It tells about an incident where a Florida swamp mysteriously ends up being covered in a red liquid. Curiosity led to the swamp being observed and studied, which revealed something interesting. 2 weeks later after the discovery, this same swamp ends up giving life to disgusting creatures, which were not limited to walking only in these waters. And the swamp ends up being contained after scientists noticed that one of the creatures was identical to a skinless human, as if the swamp was also studying them. Georgia and South Carolina. This entry is more impactful due to what happened. 777 is a realistic EAS scenario created by Superman. It tells us the story where the largest tornado ever captured by humanity ends up happening, which of course causes mass destruction and the loss of several lives. The winds came from the Gulf of Mexico, which passed through Georgia towards South and North Carolina. In this scenario, we can hear the news station itself being affected as the tornado approaches and hits the city. And if this wasn't horrible enough, the severe damage caused in a steam station in Charlotte causes a huge explosion that eventually makes the city and several surrounding towns uninhabitable, being the total kill count more than 7,000. Hawaii. The first nuclear entry. Pacific Exodus is another EAS scenario where Hawaii ends up getting fed up with the United States and ends up declaring its independence through a plan, since obviously their peaceful declaration would not end up well. For months, a secret plan was going on behind the scenes, in which several insiders ended up stealing 22 nuclear warheads from various locations around the US, and somehow they were transported to Hawaii, where the final step was to use them, in which they did. And no matter how much the leaders of Hawaii hid, in just 4 days they were captured alive and sentenced to death for having killed millions of innocent people. But what makes this entry more interesting is that this is not just in the United States. We can also see how these bombings affected the rest of the world, since the United States now had to stop supporting other countries to recover. Illinois. Okay, this one is disgusting. Not because it's bad, but I hate insects. Mirage is an analog horror created by Anomaly again. It tells the story of how human-sized insects appeared and spread through the sewers of Chicago, to the point that they began to appear and affect the cities. There's even a part where a doctor starts using these insects in surgeries. Like, he ends up putting a giant larva in the spine of one of the patients, and more disgusting scenarios, which of course led to a slow and painful death as they developed through the body. Which is so disgusting but also quite genius. I hate it. Let's just move on. Idaho. QB and Friends is an analog horror series about an education children's program that was aired on television. As the episodes went on, the videos would become increasingly corrupted, and what seemed innocent ended up showing its true colors. Because in reality, the program was used by a criminal to kidnap or to take advantage of the innocence of the children to steal their parents' credit cards. So much so that one of the first victims was a child from Idaho. Just be aware of the yellow man in the television. Louisiana. What if the water you're drinking was infected? The Dengue virus is an analog horror created by Vintage Hate. In it, we follow the perspective of a doctor who discovers a new virus that emerged from the Thick Fall River in Louisiana. This virus, after infecting the host, attacks the nervous system and the brain, which eventually will make them more aggressive, and they would attack the closest person. As much as the new virus was worrying, the government ended up doing nothing about it to not scare tourists, all for the sake of money, or so she thought. Because in fact, the virus had already infected most of the government, since what the virus wanted most was control. Which is why infected water was sold and advertised in all supermarkets in the United States. Maine. The Wonders of Maine Woods is a small unfinished analog horror created by Fried Catfish Productions. It focuses on the mysteries that Maine woods could hide, such as familiar animals, or the worst of them all, horrors beyond our comprehension, such as the Greater Presence. A disturbing creature responsible for 2 mysteries presented in 2 different videos of hikers who ended up dying, with the last recording of both containing the presence of this creature. Maryland and Connecticut. We've all thought about how the world would end, but what if it ended because of the sun? The sun disappeared is an AHS scenario, which from the name we can already tell that the sun disappears in a mysterious way. But this simulation goes further, with the perspectives of other countries, and even plans to try to keep humanity alive at drastically cold temperatures. It even gets to the point where 1 month later, the power plants are forced to create a schedule in which in every 2 hours, they would only power one different region at a time. Massachusetts. As if I didn't even do a deep dive video, Greylock is an analog horror made by Rob Gavigan. It tells us the story and the macabre incidents surrounding the Greylock Mountain. That mountain used to have underground tunnels that would lead to several chambers used in various demonic rituals by various tribes. However, the incidents within the city are connected to this mountain from the moment that a cult, or better the government, ends up buying the services of a company to do excavations without them knowing what they would find. Until, upon finding and exploring these tunnels, this team ends up dying to a mysterious illness. And with the tunnel open, the chaos in Massachusetts begins. Michigan. Of course I had to put this one. The Walton Files tells us the story of bad decisions, or as the series says, a story of broken people. It all started with the ambition of two friends, where after several years, their dream finally became true, the Bon's Burgers restaurant. As humans, the main problem arose even before this happened through an addiction. Felix, one of the founders, was an alcoholic, which in his later years, his wife left him after trying to help him several times. That same afternoon, Jack, Felix's best friend, asks him for a favor since he had no one to take his children to a school party, which Felix, to make himself feel a little bit better, accepts. But when it was time to come back, he ends up driving drunk, which causes an accident that kills both of Jack's children. What makes the Walton Files the best analog horror is, of course, the storytelling, and the fact that this is not a story about a cold killer. In the story, we can hear and see how this accident affected Felix mentally, to the point that after the accident, he tried to take his own life, but did not have the courage, leaving him with the only option of carrying the burden of his next decisions. Minnesota. Gemini Home Entertainment is interesting. Gemini Home Entertainment is an analog horror series with 18 episodes in total. It tells the story of an entity that came from space and now lives on our planet with only one intention: to destroy it, which seems to be doing a good job. The entity ends up creating wood crawlers that live, attack, and infect families with the Ruth disease, a disease that spreads quickly through the bones and causes the victim to be consumed from the inside out. The story also ends up becoming more interesting and sinister from the moment that skinwalkers and fake people are included. The story is so complex to the point that it needs its own video. Mississippi. The disease that destroyed the United States. Danse Macabre is an AHS scenario and an analog horror at the same time. It tells the story of a pathogen that emerged in Harrison County in Mississippi in 1999. The symptoms of this virus caused the victim to suffer from muscle pain, delirium, necrosis, coughing blood, and fatigue, which only had a fatality rate of 25%, but it was highly contagious. The worst part is that in a few weeks, this virus spreads to more cities and people are dying left and right, as the US doesn't find a way to fight back. Eventually, it even ends up consuming the whole country, which eventually causes other countries to become infected as well. Missouri. In a world where cryptids exist, would you have the courage to be a park ranger? Woodlands National Park is another analog horror that is still being developed. It tells us about a park in Missouri known for its beauty, but actually hid disturbing secrets. The park not only contained cryptids, such as wendigo, walkers, and cave critters, but also the company behind the park hid any incidents that these cryptids caused so as not to scare future customers, and also to keep the ritual tree a secret. All of this is told through two park rangers who secretly make videos to talk about the park. There's a specific part where a worker ends up dying, which causes 3 soldiers specialized in hunting wendigos to be sent to hunt him down, which was such a cool touch to it. Nebraska. This one only has 1 episode. The Fox Hill is another ongoing analog horror made by Screen Speak. It tells us the mystery of the fictional town of Fox Hill in Nebraska, in which its population mysteriously disappeared, along with any information about it. The mystery takes place in 1974, where most, if not all of the tapes, were recorded in that year and were eventually repaired in 2003 in what I assume to be an investigation. Everything begins to decline in one afternoon when the school janitor is never seen again, where his body is found lifeless in a strange way in Vermont, miles away from his hometown. And here we are left in the dark for now. New Hampshire. The Alvarium Logs is a new analog horror created by Hollow Walls. It talks about a plushie named Yuppie who appeared in a small town in New Hampshire. A plushie advertisement promised to help the children sleep better since they now had the presence of their new friend who could talk through pre-recorded messages. Eventually, this plushie is responsible for attracting a demon, which ends up causing some children around it to disappear. So much so that the demon waits 11 years to start attacking. The worst part is that, in addition to kidnapping children, the demon also plays with the despair of the parents, peeking into the corners of their vision while making noises of the doll that kidnapped their child. New Jersey. White Stag Education is an analog horror series about tapes that teaches the visitors of Pine Barrens, a forest in New Jersey, on how to explore and camp there safely, since the forest also had its dangers: animals, false trails, and a cult. The cult, or as the tape calls them, the Masked People, are a group of people who searches, deceives, and hunts hikers who camp in Pine Barrens to feed them to a demonic entity that I believe to be the Jersey Devil. These tapes were created specifically after several disappearances and deaths of previous campers, in which the cult can be easily identified either through their masks or their hunting whistle. New Mexico. Humans are also known for making horrors, but what if that man-made horror was actually a black hole? Black Hole is another EHS scenario created by Noel Dorito. In it, a large laboratory in Las Cruces explodes after a malfunction, in which that malfunction accidentally ends up creating a black hole that starts destroying the planet. Even after several attempts to stop it, a warning is sent to the rest of the world stating that the end has come since all attempts obviously failed, in which the Earth was going to be destroyed in the next 5 minutes. What would you do with those 5 minutes? North Carolina. Don't Look at the Moon is an AHS scenario that takes place on October 27th in Asheville, where at the time, a strange event would happen at night, the Blood Moon, which at first is declared safe, but hours later the opposite is proven due to several reports of sightings of strange entities called moonsters. Previous humans who suffered mutations due to the eclipse, and because of that, they tell us to not trust anything, not even sounds, since it was just a moonster trying to lure you out of your house. North Dakota. Creepy broadcast shows the hijacking that happened at a Jamestown station in North Dakota. This macabre hijacking appears to say that it was just a test of the emergency broadcast system, but instead of playing the classic sounds that we already know, we hear a man who says goodbye to a woman before shooting her and her daughter. If that wasn't disturbing enough to hear in the middle of the night, he then moves on to Patricia's last daughter, in which he ends up burning her alive while the last sentence appears: "Woman beware, you're next." And after the message, the programming returns to normal. Ohio. One of my favorite entries, the Genesis Index, is a new analog horror channel which currently has 3 tapes, 1 trailer, and 1 spoiler. The story is still pretty unclear since it's still an ongoing series, but from what I could understand, it tells us the story of a technology company that is somehow connected with the incident that left several areas of the United States uninhabitable, being them Ohio, West Virginia, etc. I assume that what caused the incident was an explosion, but there is still little to speculate. For now, the story ends up with an experiment on a guinea pig that goes horribly wrong. Oklahoma. The Watcher's Outbreak is bizarrely good. It's a mix of EAS scenario and analog horror, and it tells us the story of a hijack from an entity called the Watcher. This hijack was actually the message of this entity, which promised the destruction of southern United States, which obviously caused panic among the population, but no matter how alert they were, nothing prepared them for what was coming. Over the course of a month, several incidents began to happen in the cities of Oklahoma, North and South Carolina, Arkansas, etc., which created a domino effect: dark fog, giant waves of people disappearing, and strong tornadoes that caused a mass destruction. But this time, humanity survives to tell the story. Oregon. Oregon Parks Department is another analog horror series about a fictional park in Oregon. In this channel, we follow the tapes created by a park ranger named Gus Burnside. He ends up recording his last 9 days after finding sinister incidents and messages through the park. In one of those days, he finds a strange book that has his name written on it, Bill Cipher's book. Paranoid, he tries to get rid of it, but unfortunately he is unsuccessful. When the 9 days are up, he ends up being found dead inside one of the cabins, and the investigation begins. This analog horror goes so far as to have its own website, which would reveal more about the lore as we introduce each code. Pennsylvania and New York. The World One Phenomenon is a 1-episode analog horror created by Dr. Nowhere. It tells us about an incident that happened in Pennsylvania, about a scary hijack that happened in the middle of the afternoon, which had a demonic creature. To counter the hijack, NERC orders all power grids to be shut down to prevent more civilians from seeing the creepy broadcast and being affected by it. which resulted in 15 million people being left without power in Pennsylvania and New York. Those who saw the broadcast ended up suffering from pseudocoma, an extremely rare condition where one ends up losing control of the body and thus becomes paralyzed. And now, the victims are doomed for the rest of their lives to see the demon. Tennessee. Pastra's analog horror. Dreams of an Insomniac is an analog horror that puts us in the shoes of Tommy Merrick. When visiting his parents' house, he ends up coming across a box of VHS tapes. And now, the episode really begins. The mystery focuses on the town of Eastridge, Tennessee, which ends up being tormented in the Halloween night of 1986 with the disappearance of 6 children. With this incident, witnesses ended up reporting it, which caused a warning to be sent to the region. The culprit was using the following disguise: a tail, a dark mask with yellow eyes and a big smile, and a orange suit. What they at first thought to be human was actually a demon, and thus calling him the Smiling Snatcher. The story develops to a point where one company ends up quote-unquote studying the demon to create a PSA on how to avoid it and how to minimize the chances of it killing them, which I honestly thought it was in vain. Texas. Tri-Red Witnesses Archives is an analog horror series that I'm already familiar with. In it, we follow the incidents that happen in the city of Tri-Red in Texas, where the company Tri-Red Witnesses Foundation is created with the intention of finding missing people. In order to do this, they partner with the Tri-Red Police Department, and together they create a program, where now, the reports of missing people go to Tri-Red instead of going to the police. But since this is an analog horror, something has to happen. In fact, what Tri-Red did was hide or destroy any clue or trace that they found, so they could cover the tracks of a malicious group that was hiding in the forest of the Tri-Red Park. And every 40 seconds, someone goes missing in the Tri-Red city. Delaware and Utah. This entry will be different because I will cover 2 tapes, which together makes one story. In the analog horror The Beholder, we follow a character named Oliver who ends up buying Japanese chemicals on the to use them in a laboratory in Canton, Utah in 1981. But in the laboratory, something goes terribly wrong, which leads us to the other episode, The Evoking, where now, in 2019, these chemicals end up causing an epidemic of a virus called Tenebrium nervous infection, which infected the nervous system, spine, and then the brain, where 36 hours later, the infected would start biting healthy people to transmit the virus, as we can see in the Delaware incident, almost like a zombie virus. This analog horror is so well done that the moment that struck me the most was the last sound of the US sirens before it collapses to the virus. Vermont. A game to be different this time. Fears of Phantom is an analog horror game where 3 friends end up spending the weekend in an Airbnb in Woodbury, Vermont. But in the beginning there's only 2 friends in the house, Arp and Mike. While they're there, they fish, cook, play games, put up with the weird house owner, etc. You know, normal things that would happen in an Airbnb. Until in the middle of the night, Mike ends up leaving Arp alone to go and get Nora since her car broke down. And from here on, things start to get more chaotic. Minutes after Mike leaves, a snowstorm happens, which causes one of the hikers to knock on the door to ask to come in. Alone, of course Harp denies, which makes him go mad and tries to enter by force through the basement, in which that makes Harp message the creepy house owner for help, in which he comes armed, only for her to know minutes later that the real house owner hadn't been in that house for weeks, as now that creepy guy finds out that she discovers the truth and tries to kill her. Virginia. The Foundation Files is an analog horror series that I've already covered in a video. It tells us about the mysteries surrounding a city in northern Virginia with the supernatural, which eventually caused the evacuation and isolation of some states so that the creatures will not spread throughout the United States. But even with the containment, it doesn't mean that they were 100% safe, as we can see from the invasion. Washington and South Dakota. Monument Mythos. Where do I start? Monument Mythos is an analog horror so complex that it could easily be an iceberg. For me, Monument Mythos is an analog horror about timelines where we can see all the endings due to the resets that Gothanaut A ends up giving. But this is just my oversimplified theory. The analog horror in general focuses on the monsters that hide in the statues and how those creatures had affected the United States, since the monuments were used to feed the serpent and exchange humans for doppelgangers so that it can control their actions, and thus conquer the United States. West Virginia. And of course, I couldn't forget about the dad of analog horrors, Local 58 is an analog horror about a small television channel in Mason County, West Virginia. Throughout the episodes, the same station comes into conflict with the various hijacks who want to transmit worrying programs and messages. So much so that in one episode we can see a fight between two transmitters, one wanting the good and another wanting the opposite, in which the hijacker was the moon or the entity that lived on the moon. Wisconsin. Police Archives is one of the 3 episodes of the Fnaf VHS series created by Spectra. In this episode, we follow the perspective of the police who are investigating a new string of missing people from the restaurant in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, this time being 3. 2 employees from Freddy Fazbear's who were attacked by animatronics, and 1 paranormal investigator that was shot while trying to flee by the main suspect that hid within the building. This all ties back to the last time Henry, the prime suspect, was seen free. With all the lawsuits piling up, the company ends up almost going bankrupt, which forces Henry and Chris to become scrappers, and they eventually get caught in a stolen van by the police. As they wouldn't want to go to prison, they end up and fleeing to a mall, in which the last officer chases them down, and now has to face both armed suspects and their animatronic before backup arrives. Wyoming. And for last, another classic. Wyoming Incident is a creepypasta of a bizarre hijacking that took place in, you guessed it, Wyoming. This hijacking happened in the 2000s and consisted of several CGI hats in different positions with cryptic messages, such as, "You will see such pretty things. What hides in your mind, you cannot hide forever." While at the same time, loud audios were playing, which could cause headaches, vomiting, and even dizziness. But despite this creepy broadcast, the hackers were never found. And since you watched this video to the very end, what about photos with disturbing backstories? And what I could take away from this is, please pick other states for your analog horrors, and don't be afraid of using real places for storytelling purposes. Whatever. If you like this video, you already know what to do. Thank you so much for watching, and take care, my friend.